There is a phase in the spiritual walk that almost nobody likes to admit, yet many people live through in silence. The one where you pray, and it feels like nothing happens. You talk to God, use the same words as always, try to focus, try to believe, try to keep your heart in the right place. But the feeling is that your prayers don't get past the ceiling. There is no clear answer, no evident direction, no immediate comfort like you felt in other moments. And little by little, an idea starts forming inside you: God is far away. Maybe you don't say that out loud, because it sounds wrong, like a lack of faith. But the thought shows up backstage in your mind, especially when days get heavier, when problems pile up, and you need intervention, a sign, any evidence that God is listening. Silence starts to be interpreted as distance. Delay starts to be confused with absence. And that creates frustration. A frustration that isn't anger at God, but weariness. Weariness of asking for the same things. Weariness of repeating the same prayers. Weariness of waiting for changes that never seem to come. You don't want to give up on faith, but you also don't know how to keep the same enthusiasm you had before. Then guilt comes in. Because you learned that faith is confidence, certainty, firmness. And when you notice yourself discouraged, confused, or emotionally dry, the first conclusion is usually, the problem is me. You start examining yourself all the time, reviewing your actions, your failures, past sins, distractions, falls. Your mind tries to find an explanation for the silence, and almost always points back at you. Maybe I'm not praying right. Maybe I'm spiritually cold. Maybe I disappointed God. Meanwhile, comparison makes everything worse. You look at other people who seem so secure, so full of faith, so spiritually excited. You hear testimonies of quick answers, miracles, doors opening. You see people speaking enthusiastically about what God is doing, and you start to feel like a stranger in the middle of it all. As if everyone else is living a close God, except you. That hurts in a quiet way. Because now it's not just life struggles weighing on you. It's the feeling of being spiritually behind. As if there's something broken in your faith. As if you lost something the strong believers still have. And without realizing it, your relationship with God starts being filtered through this sense of inadequacy. Until a dangerous thought shows up, one you try to push away immediately. Maybe God doesn't want to hear me anymore. It's not rebellion. It's pain. It's the attempt to make sense of a silence that feels too long. It's the heart searching for an explanation, even if it hurts. Because sometimes it feels easier to think God doesn't want to listen than to live with the uncertainty of not understanding what He's doing. But what if this feeling doesn't mean what you think? There is a pattern in Scripture that many people overlook. The moments of greatest spiritual depth almost always come with silence, waiting, and the feeling of God's absence. It's not an exception, not an accident, not automatic proof of spiritual failure. It's part of the journey of people who were deeply faithful. David, for example, didn't write only psalms of victory. He also wrote prayers that echo exactly what many people feel today but are afraid to admit. Again and again he asks, "How long, Lord? How long will the pain last? How long will enemies seem to win? How long will God seem distant?" That question doesn't come from someone who abandoned faith. It comes from someone in the middle of faith, but not feeling the closeness he longs for. David keeps praying even without understanding. Keeps talking to God even without perceiving an answer. His faith is not sustained by constant feelings of presence, but by a decision not to break the relationship, even in silence. Job goes through something even more intense. He loses almost everything: family, health, stability, dignity. In the middle of suffering, he speaks, questions, laments, pours out his pain before God. But for a long time, There is no explanation, no immediate intervention, no quick relief that brings meaning to what's happening. Heaven seems closed. And still, Job keeps addressing God. That matters. He doesn't stop talking to God because of the silence. He continues, even without answers. His experience shows that divine silence is not incompatible with divine presence. God was there, even if he wasn't explaining himself. The prophets knew this territory well. They looked at injustice, violence, the suffering of the people, and cried out, "How long?" It's the cry of those who believe but don't understand, who expect action but find delay. Those questions are recorded in the Bible not to show lack of faith, but faith in an environment of silence. And then there is Jesus. On the cross, in one of the most intense moments of pain in history, he declares, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That phrase reveals the depth of the human experience of feeling God's absence. Jesus expresses the weight of a moment where the Father seems distant. That doesn't mean the Father truly abandoned him, but it shows that the feeling of abandonment can be part of the experience even of the most faithful. The Bible does not hide these scenes. It doesn't erase these anguished prayers. It doesn't pretend that men and women of faith lived in constant feelings of closeness. On the contrary, it records these moments to show that real faith includes seasons when God seems silent. That changes how you interpret your phase. Maybe what you're living is not proof that your faith has failed, but proof that you've entered territory many faithful people have already crossed. A territory where God is not absent, just not obvious. The distance you feel may be a place where God is working in silence. There comes a point in the spiritual journey when everything feels more fragile, but is actually becoming deeper. It's when you realize you no longer feel God the way you used to, and almost automatically conclude something is wrong. But often what's changing is not God's presence, it's the structure of your faith. At the beginning of the journey, faith usually walks hand in hand with emotion. You pray and feel peace. You worship and get emotional. You read something and it feels like God is speaking directly to you. These experiences matter. They strengthen, encourage, and show that God is real and near. But they also have an initial role, helping build the foundation. The problem comes when faith starts depending on that to keep existing. Without noticing, you begin to associate God's presence with pleasant feelings. If you feel something, God is near. If you don't, he must be far. But faith at its core was never defined as feeling, it was defined as trusting. And real trust starts forming precisely when feelings stop being the main support. This is where God begins to mature your faith. Not because he wants to hide, but because he wants you to learn to walk by conviction, not constant emotional stimulation. The removal of feeling is not punishment, it's transition. Like someone who, after being guided by the hand for a long time, needs to learn to walk with steady steps. The support decreases not to weaken, but to strengthen. Emotional dependence gives way to real trust. Before, you sought God and your security came from what you felt afterward. Now you seek God even without feeling anything different, and that reveals a deep change. Your faith begins to rely less on what happens inside you and more on who God is, independently of you. You gradually learn to seek God not for immediate comfort, but for his character. Not for the goosebumps, but for the truth. Not for a striking experience, but for the certainty that he is still the same, even when your senses don't confirm it. That changes your spiritual motivation. Before, maybe you approached God expecting relief, quick answers, a sense of peace. Now you come because you've decided he is still worthy of your trust, even when the experience is quiet. Faith stops being driven by emotional reward and starts being sustained by relationship. And deep relationships survive silence. What you're living may feel like weakening, but it may be deepening. The surface is calmer, less intense, less emotional. But underneath, roots are forming. Roots that don't depend on favorable weather to keep existing. Maybe God isn't far. Maybe he's taking you deeper. When God seems distant, the most common reaction is to try to fix it by force. You pray louder, try to get emotional, chase an experience that brings back the feeling you had before. But this phase of faith is not solved with emotional intensity, it's crossed with quiet consistency. The first step is to keep praying, even without desire. That may sound contradictory, because we learn to associate prayer with inspiration. But in this phase, prayer stops being something you do because you feel and becomes something you do because you've decided to remain. Sometimes prayer will feel simple, repetitive, even dry. Still, it keeps the relationship alive. You don't pray because you feel a lot. You pray because you don't want to walk away, even when your heart is tired. The second step is to reduce the pressure to feel something. Many people suffer more from expectation than from the phase itself. You pray already evaluating, did I feel anything? Was it strong enough? Did God speak to me? This constant self-analysis turns spiritual life into an emotional test. But God's presence is not measured by the level of goosebumps you feel. When you stop demanding a specific sensation, you make room for a more stable, less anxious, deeper faith. The third step is to be honest with God about the emptiness. There is no need to fake spirituality before Him. The Bible is full of sincere prayers filled with doubt, weariness, and confusion. Saying, "God, I feel distant," doesn't push you away from Him. It's actually a way of keeping the relationship real. Honesty keeps the connection alive even when emotion is low. Mature faith isn't pretending strength. It's continuing to draw near while aware of your own weakness. The fourth step is understanding that persistence builds a faith that doesn't break. Faith based only on intense moments can be strong for a while, but it doesn't survive life's long seasons. Faith built in faithful repetition, praying again, trusting again, staying again, grows deep roots. This faith doesn't depend on ideal circumstances or elevated emotional states. It learns to continue in dry ground, and that's why it becomes resilient. If this message describes exactly what you're living and it's helping you understand a phase that once felt like pure confusion, subscribe to the channel. Here we talk about real faith, the kind that keeps existing even when there are no strong feelings, quick answers, or spectacular moments. Because God's presence is not always felt, but it is always real. God's silence is one of the hardest experiences in the spiritual journey, and also one of the most misunderstood. When answers don't come, when prayers seem to hit the ceiling, when the presence once easily perceived no longer feels the same, the automatic conclusion is almost always, God stepped away. But silence does not mean absence. In our human logic, presence is noise, movement, immediate response. If someone is silent, we assume they left. But with God it doesn't work that way. He doesn't depend on constant signs to be present. Often what changes is not His closeness, but how you perceive it. And failed perception is not proof of abandonment. God also works in the invisible. Much of what He does doesn't first appear in circumstances, but inside you. While you look outward expecting visible change, He may be transforming something deeper. Your emotional structure, your motivation, your dependence, your way of trusting. This kind of work makes no noise, doesn't produce immediate testimonies, doesn't bring instant relief, but it sustains a lifetime. Moments of apparent distance shape the depth of faith. When everything is clear, answers come quickly, and His presence is easily felt, faith grows, but in a more superficial way. In seasons of silence, faith has to grow roots. You continue not because you're being emotionally rewarded, but because you've chosen to trust even without understanding. And trust without emotional support is what turns fragile faith into deep faith. The strongest faith is born when emotion runs out. As long as faith depends on feeling something to keep existing, it's still leaning on unstable internal circumstances. Emotions fluctuate. Good days and hard days alternate. But when faith survives even on dry days, when you keep praying without goosebumps, believing without excitement, walking without clear signs, it stops being reaction and becomes conviction. And conviction is far more resilient than emotion. This difficult phase is not the end, it's transformation. It's not the closing of your story with God, but a change of level. The transition from faith based on frequent experiences to faith based on ongoing relationship. You're not being pushed away, you're being deepened. What feels like loss of sensation may be the birth of a trust that won't be easily shaken in the future. Maybe you are not far from God. Maybe you are learning to trust Him in the dark. If God seems distant, it may be exactly there that your faith is becoming real.